anyone not, sir?
The sinking of the Titanic is one of the most preserved disasters in our pop culture. Whether it's one of the countless narrative films, novels, documentaries, or even television appearances, Titanic has become a staple of Western media. I mean, just look at this movie playing right here. You could probably count the people on one hand who have never seen this movie before. Titanic is by far the most memorable and documented maritime disaster of all time. The tale of a ship claimed to be unsinkable, the largest moving object at its time, striking an iceberg on the third night of its maiden voyage, and then sinking 2 hours and 40 minutes later. A ship only stocked with lifeboats for about half the people on board. A ship with a crew so poorly trained that said lifeboats were only filled about half full, leaving over 1,500 people to freeze to death in the North Atlantic. So is it the death toll that's made this story so memorable? The drama surrounding the sinking? Or rather, is it just man's hubris of thinking something they created can truly be unsinkable? What is it about this tragedy that makes people want to see it over and over again? There are two questions I want to answer. One, why is the story of the Titanic so popular? And two, are the films that are made about the Titanic made responsibly? Well, to answer these questions, we're going to have to go all the way back to the very beginning. Believe it or not, the first dramatized narrative of the Titanic sinking came out less than 1 month after. Saved from the Titanic was a 10-minute silent film made by producer Jules Bruletar and starring actress Dorothy Gibson. Gibson was actually one of the surviving passengers on board the Titanic and made it out in the very first lifeboat that was launched. She signed on to do the film just a few days after walking off the Carpathia in New York. Gibson and Bruletar were romantically involved and is probably the reason she agreed to do it. I mean, fame is great and all, but is it really worth reliving uncompromisingly traumatic memories that happened just a few days before? There are even reports of Gibson losing her composure and bawling in between takes. For her, filming the movie didn't even open old wounds. Her wounds weren't even close to being closed in the first place. She even wore the exact same outfit she'd been wearing when the real ship went down. Part of the film is just stock footage of the Titanic's sister ship, the RMS Olympic, and of Titanic's captain, Edward Smith. However, most of the film follows a fictional love story, if you even want to call it that. While Gibson technically plays herself, it is definitely a very fictional version of herself. Her events in the movie do play out how they do on the ship, however she is given a fictional fiancé in the Navy waiting for her in New York. After she arrives in New York, she decides she cannot handle being married to a man who works at sea. Gibson's parents thus make her fiancé choose between her and the sea. When he chooses the sea, Dorothy Gibson's father has so much respect for him that he literally gives his daughter to him, despite her feelings. The film was complete and released a mere 29 days after the ship sunk. At the time, film was still in its infancy, and it was not yet believed what was acceptable and what wasn't in regards to making films surrounding tragedies. So was it actually offensive though? Was Jules Bruletar just trying to capitalize on the tragedy to make a quick buck? Quick answer is yes, and oh god, absolutely yes. 29 days. 29 days after the sinking, this movie was released. Not only that, but it had nothing to do with the sinking. But Jules Bruletar knew how to capitalize. He knew that if he made this movie, people were going to see it, and see it they did. This was the first time it became clear that people were drawn to this tragedy. It wasn't just another news story that was going to keep headlines for a month. This was something that was going to stay with people for a long time. And filmmakers became increasingly aware of this as time went on. 41 years would pass until another English-speaking Titanic film would be released. Until then, Germany threw its hat into the ring. The summer after the sinking, a German filmmaker named Mime Missu directed a film called In Nacht und Eis, which translates to In Night and Ice. Then, in 1943, Germany released a Nazi propaganda film they just called Titanic. The former was a fair attempt at a touching tribute, portraying the characters in a heroic light and conveying the sinking for the horrible tragedy that it was. I mean, for God's sakes, you have Captain Smith swimming to a lifeboat, being offered a seat by a passenger, declining the offer, and then swimming away to accept his fate. The latter went the opposite direction. The objective of Nazi propaganda was to paint Germans in a very courageous, heroic light, and Germany's enemies, in this case Great Britain and the US, in a negative, cowardly light. The movie features a fictitious German officer who rallies the passengers and saves many of their lives while portraying the British officers as ineffective and cowardly. The movie also heavily relied on the underlying theme of how British and American capitalism is what caused the disaster, as well as the rest of the world's problems. The movie was commissioned by a one Joseph Goebbels. If you've ever seen Inglourious Basterds, it was this guy. He was originally very excited about the prospect. However, once it hit the theaters, he realized that trying to improve his citizens' morale with a film about a mass disaster might not be the most effective method while they were constantly under threat of being bombed by the Allies. He thus eventually banned the film from all theaters. Considering it's the Nazis, it would be kinda pointless to discuss the ethics of using this tragedy for them to achieve their goals, so let's just focus on the mindset of the filmmakers. Why was this the story that these propaganda filmmakers decided to use? Why was a British ship sinking on its way to America the right story to make German citizens hate the Allies? Sure, you have the capitalistic greed angle, but is that enough? Or is there something more to it that made this story so captivating to these German filmmakers? Was it the existing drama that surrounded the sinking? Or was it their ability to twist and mold this true story into something unrecognizable until it suited their needs? I mean, yeah, they changed their mind about it, but the propaganda filmmakers originally thought it would be a good idea. I think they took note of the actual heroism that took place while the ship was sinking. Goebbels saw that the Titanic sinking was a true test of human character and bravery, and he thus thought it'd be perfect to insert and change it to represent German character and bravery. The interest really started to become even more prevalent a decade later in the 1950s with the release of two huge budget films just 5 years apart. They are Titanic and A Night to Remember, with the latter being loosely based on the novel of the same name by Walter Lord. What these two films did was introduce an entirely new generation to the Titanic. The newer generation was obviously aware of what had happened from stories and history books, but these two big-budget films are what really introduced Titanic into Western pop culture. The 1953 Titanic was the first American film made on the subject. In 1929, there was a film called The Atlantic that was very loosely based on the ship, but it's hard to count that considering they didn't even give the ship the same name. It was the 1953 film that truly sparked the massive interest in Titanic, spawning Titanic enthusiasts and even future filmmakers. However, I would say that calling the film loosely based would be generous. The film takes place on a ship called the Titanic that hits an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sinks with 70% of the passengers perishing. That's about the only part of the real story we get. The film centers on a fictional couple dealing with their own unrelated issues, with the Titanic as just a backdrop. Remind you of any other movie? Although, unlike the '97 version, the film centers around a couple breaking up versus getting together. The movie follows Julia Sturgis boarding the Titanic with her two children in an attempt to flee from her husband's fat cat society. At the last moment, her husband, Richard Sturgis, boards the ship in an effort to stop them. When he confronts his wife, she comes clean with him about an affair she had and reveals to him that their son is not his. He then gives up all claim to his son and begins ignoring him. And that's the movie. The ship doesn't even strike the iceberg until the final act, where Richard Sturgis then loads up his wife, daughter, and son into a lifeboat and says goodbye to them. Now this is the moment where the film becomes slightly offensive. You all know about the women and children first rule. The children first part makes sense, of course, but the Titanic sunk in a time period where women were seen as helpless maidens, while men were seen as chivalrous, heroic knights. So as the Sturgis lifeboat is being lowered, a grown woman cries out for a spot on it even though there are none left. Thus Richard's 10-year-old son, Norman, jumps out and offers her his seat, which she gladly accepts. I think the director was trying to convey that even someone so young can still be heroic, but what comes across is really just a harsh representation of old-timey gender stereotypes. I mean, we see a grown woman crying and screaming from fear gladly accept a seat from a child. However, we as the audience are not supposed to find anything wrong with this because Norman is a man in training. He will one day be required to be heroic and chivalrous and save helpless maidens, so he might as well start as early as possible, right? Fast forward 5 years and we get to see another big budget take on it. The British film A Night to Remember, directed by Roy Baker. To this day, this film is seen as the most accurate portrayal of the disaster. Unlike other versions, it does not create a fictional love story with the sinking just happening in the background. This film actually just focuses on the sinking. I know, hard to believe, right? However, since there was not a fictional main character to focus on, Roy Baker had to choose one of the main players on the ship to be the focus of the film. And he chose Second Officer Charles Lightoller. Lightoller was the highest surviving officer on the ship. Focusing on one of the survivors meant we'd get to see his journey from beginning to end, After the sinking, he was revered as one of the bravest and most heroic survivors on the ship. This was definitely a man the audience could root for, and the clear and obvious choice for a main character. But we can't forget about the side characters. J. Bruce Ismay, Captain Edward Smith, First Officer Murdoch, Thomas Andrews, Molly Brown, the list goes on and on. Each character supposedly portrayed to the fullest degree of accuracy, both in actions and strength of character. Seems pretty responsible, right? However, is the film truly as accurate as they claim it is? Well, let's break it down, character by character. First you have Thomas Andrews. Testimony from one of the stewards, John Stewart, placed Thomas Andrews in the first-class smoking room at 210, 10 minutes before the ship sunk. He said that Andrews had his arms crossed and was staring at the painting above the fireplace. This became a very poetic image of his demise. The architect of the ship just accepting his fate, not even wearing his life preserver. However, it was later revealed that the testifying steward had actually left the ship on a lifeboat at 1:40. More accurate testimony revealed that Andrews was on the deck of the ship until the very end. He took charge of panic-stricken passengers and directed them to the remaining lifeboats. He also continued throwing as much deck furniture into the ocean as he could in hopes that some people might use it to stay afloat. Thomas Andrews tried his absolute hardest to save as many people as possible, and yet, for some reason, the smoking room version is the one the film went with. Then, of course, you have the managing director, J. Bruce Ismay. People lost their mind when they found out that he survived the sinking when so many had perished. According to his testimony, he was literally the only person around a particular lifeboat when it was about to be lowered. However, some others testified that he did in fact push himself through an incredibly bustling crowd of people to get to that lifeboat. I mean, I think it's up to you to decide which one is more plausible. Captain Edward J. Smith has about 5 different versions of his demise. Some survivors claim they saw him dive into the ocean when the ship went down. Some said that he shot himself in the head. Some said that they saw him swimming to one of the lifeboats with a child in his arms. However, can you really fault the movie when there are conflicting reports? The film has to remain matter of fact and can't really offer alternative theories as to what they portray. They pick something and they run with it. It makes sense, I get it. But what about the hard facts? The events where there was no conflicting testimony. Is it responsible to change those events to better suit your film? I mean, let's look at what the actual Charles Lightoller did that night. He was responsible for loading the port side lifeboats. His starboard counterpart would load women and children first, and then let men on board if no women and children were around. However, Lightoller was very strict with women and children only. That fact was portrayed in the film. However, something that was not in the film was how full Lightoller's lifeboats were. In the film, almost all of Lightoller's lifeboats were launched completely full to try and show that he was saving as many people as he could. However, in reality, Charles Lightoller launched his boats with lots of empty seats on them. He did this for 2 reasons. One was because he refused the seats to men to the extent that he denied them seats even when there was plenty of room. And 2, because he wasn't sure how much weight the boats could hold. The crew of the Titanic had not been adequately trained on how to launch the lifeboats. A whopping 500 more people could have been saved if the lifeboats had been filled to capacity. A Night to Remember does touch on this fact, however it puts the blame solely on First Officer Murdoch and leaves Lightoller out of it. They also portray Murdoch in a more apathetic light, making him look like someone who had no business being in a position of power. This all trying to add to the heroic valor of our main character. Is a change like this something you can live with? I mean, most of the film is very accurate, and it actually focuses on the disaster instead of how fictional characters perceive it. The 1953 Titanic and A Night to Remember are the perfect side-by-side comparisons. You have 2 films, just 5 years apart, one American, one British. You get to see the interpretation of the disaster from both countries that were involved in the incident. It's almost like a sociological experiment on how we as nations perceive tragedy. But were these films made responsibly? Well, for the 1953 Titanic, I would have to say no. The film does very little to portray the accurate story of what happened. The fictional family the film centers around just creates a lens that not only distorts the picture, but makes it nearly unrecognizable. Which was essentially what the filmmakers were going for. At that point in history, the details of the sinking were known, but had not yet become embedded in our pop culture. Why would it matter if Hollywood left out 90% of the story? Most people who were going to see the film didn't know the whole story anyway. I mean, it had been 40 years, and most schools didn't really see it as essential to the history curriculum. And as for A Night to Remember, I would say yes. For the most part. There are the discrepancies about Second Officer Lightoller, but biopics sometimes have a hard time between being completely accurate and telling an engaging story. What's important is that this movie truly made us feel the weight of the tragedy, not through seeing the ship sink, but rather seeing the ship sink through the eyes of these characters we cared about. It was so much easier to sympathize with these characters than in the previous film because we knew that they were based off people who were actually there. These performances were distinguished tributes to those who died and to those who lived. So you have one film that centers around a fictional couple with not that much to do with the sinking, and then one film that tries its hardest to get every last detail about the sinking accurate. Well, 40 years later, a man named James Cameron tried his hardest to combine both concepts into one epic film, which is of course the 1997 version of Titanic. This is the film that most people think of when you say the word Titanic. It won 11 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. It was the most expensive movie ever made at the time, and held the title of highest grossing film of all time for 13 years. So what on earth was so special about it? Was it Leo and Kate? Was it the big budget set pieces? Was it the special effects? Or just the fact that people want to see films about the Titanic? Well, let's first try to look at what's good about this film. First of all, this film is just visually epic. The presence that the ship creates is indescribable. I mean, we take it for granted now, but just truly take a second and admire how impressive these visuals were, especially in 1997. But does it hold its own outside of that? Does the film actually have merit to it? Or was everyone in 1997 just swept up by the hype? If you're looking to just compare it to the other films, then this movie can be described as the best of both worlds. Like the '53 version, it focuses on the love story of a fictional couple. However, everything outside of the romance in this film is portrayed almost identically to A Night to Remember. Right down to the scene of how the band starts playing Nearer My God to Thee, how they all start walking away, but then Wallace Hartley starts playing the song, and then the rest of the band returns to join him. Yeah, there was no testimony, false or otherwise, of this taking place. Cameron totally copied it from A Night to Remember. So because the details of the films are so similar, how about instead of focusing on plot, we focus on emotion? Specifically the emotion that the film creates for its viewers. To do that, why don't we look at by far the most emotional sequence in the film, the ship sinking. Cameron did not pull any punches when it came to portraying the sinking. Watching this sequence makes you really understand the anxiety and horror that these people were feeling at the time. This sinking sequence is so much more effective than in the '53 version, where everyone on board just sings Nearer My God to Thee as they slowly lower into the ocean. It's unrealistic and a little cheesy. The Cameron version, on the other hand, truly made you feel the weight of the situation. And I mean, isn't that the one detail that matters most? The weight of the situation? I mean, the main takeaway from this tragedy should be the tragedy itself. The best way that we can honor what happened is to portray exactly what happened. The details are definitely important, but maybe even more crucial to the story is portraying the emotions felt by those experiencing the tragedy. And that is definitely what Cameron did. Since Cameron recreated the ship so epically, and didn't shy away from the harsh realities of what the people went through, can we really get on his case so much about the fictional romance and Celine Dion songs? Was this film made responsibly? Overall, I would say yes. I mean, don't get me wrong, I would have loved to focus on the historical figures more, or at least focus on the romance less. But James Cameron was actually trying to tell the story of the ship. He truly believed that using these two as a framing device was the most effective way to get people invested in the story. I may disagree with him, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't still trying to tell Titanic's story. He was flat out obsessed with this ship for years, so much so that he made it his mission to tell the ship's story as best he could. So, to summarize, how do you make a responsible version of Titanic? Well, you just tell the story of the ship. If you include fiction, make sure it fits. Don't just tell someone else's story with the ship as a backdrop. Don't use the story selfishly for nothing more than financial gain. Just be respectful and don't abuse the memory of those who perished. We still have one unanswered question though. Why is this story so popular? I mean, these films I covered are just the tip of the proverbial iceberg, no pun intended. So many TV movies, novels, films, and documentaries have graced our media over and over again because people always want to see more. I think the truth is that there are so many reasons why Titanic is so popular. It is a cautionary tale from a different age. The disaster represents that as a people we can become overconfident and it can lead to our downfall. The story of the Titanic is man versus nature. Nature was disrespected and she fought back. I also think the popularity of Titanic media is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more things that are released, the more people want to see. There are so many documentaries on the subject because each new filmmaker believes they have finally found something new to discuss, or has a new angle on a previously discussed subject. I don't believe that something like Pearl Harbor or 9/11 will ever be such a media staple, no matter how much time passes, because they were acts of evil. They were tragedies that were manufactured by malicious intent, and that makes the subject far less appealing. The one thing I'd like you to take away from this is that there's a difference between telling a story and capitalizing on a tragedy. Where's the line drawn? Well, honestly, it's ever-changing. I mean, do filmmakers sometimes ignore the little voice in their head that remind them to be respectful, honest, and accurate? Of course they do. That's why we get garbage like this. But for everyone else, I think they can remember that art and respect go hand in hand.